Welcome to this Fabian Society online speaker meeting. We're still adjusting to our technology enhanced, corona diminished new world, but we've got some fantastic meetings coming up using this webinar technology, and we're absolutely delighted that tonight's event is a special session with Rachel Reeves, and she's going to be talking to us tonight about the pamphlet that she published with the Fabian Society about 6 months ago called Everyday Socialism, which brought together a range of economic experts and politicians to talk about what Rachel calls the everyday economy, the foundational elements of the economy that really make everything else work. And couldn't be a more important time to be talking about that, because we're seeing with the COVID-19 crisis the importance of those essential, mainly services jobs, usually low paid, for keeping the economy going and keeping our public services going. So in so many ways, this is a more timely conversation even than when Rachel published the pamphlet 6 months ago. The hashtag, if you're a Twitter user, for today's meeting is Everyday Socialism. So do please use that and get involved on social media. But we'd also like you to get involved during the course of the meeting by asking questions. You don't need to hold back till the end of Rachel's remarks, because you can type in questions all the way through. And what we'll do is pick a number of you to ask questions once we've heard from our speakers. The way this will work is that you can see other people's questions and you can vote for your favorite questions. So we'll take some account of which questions all of you think are the best and put those to Rachel first. It's not just Rachel we'll be hearing from, because I'm delighted that we also have John Tomaney from I'm losing your institution. I think it's UCL, John. Are you is that correct?
Yes.
I had a sudden blank in my mind. John is one of the chapter authors and writes a really important chapter on what we try not to call left behind places, but the areas of the country that were definitive in this election we just had and have been struggling with post-industrial economies, and are so important both from an economic and political perspective. So we'll hear first from Rachel and then from John. There's also a chat function in the Zoom video conference, and keep an eye out for that, because we'll send some links to things that are referred to during the meeting through that chat function. The most important being that you'll see a link to the pamphlet, so you can have a look at the pamphlet online as we're going. So that's enough of the introduction. I'm now really pleased to welcome Rachel Reeves to introduce the conversation this evening and tell us a little bit about, first of all, the pamphlet she wrote 6 months ago, and then, even more importantly, why it matters now with the corona crisis far more than we ever realized. Rachel.
Well, thank you very much, Andy, and thank you to the Fabian Society for hosting this event this evening. The Everyday Socialism pamphlet that I published with the Fabians last September builds on previous work that I had done on what I call the everyday economy. And the everyday economy for me is focusing really on what matters to people in their everyday lives. So work and how we value it and how people are valued in the workplace. It's about the places we live and the communities in which we live, and it's about families and relationships. And those are the things that essentially matter to all of us in our everyday lives. And the reason I thought that it was worth thinking and writing a little bit more about these issues is because issues of the everyday, I think, are too often lost in the economic debate and the debate that economists have about what sort of economy we want and how we measure success. We often talk about the high-performing businesses on the technological frontier, the tradable sectors in the economy, rather than the things that actually matter to us in our lives. And so that's what the everyday economy and everyday socialism is trying to redress. There's a lot of talk at the moment about what is also sometimes called the foundational economy. And the foundational economy, and I guess the everyday economy, could also be described as that part of the economy without which the rest of society and the rest of the economy wouldn't be able to function. It's the part of the economy that sustains us all. So it's about health and social care, it's about housing and education, it's about food, its manufacture and its distribution. And obviously all these parts of the economy are seen today as very much essential because they are the only parts that are still properly functioning, and they're the parts that are going to enable us to get through this crisis. But the truth is, these parts of the economy are often underappreciated, undervalued, and to a large extent just taken for granted. Now, that's not true at the moment, but there is a risk that when this pandemic is past, as it surely will be at some point, that we go back to business as usual and again undervalue, underappreciate and take for granted those parts of our economic life that help sustain all of us. Now, some of you might say, well, of course, everything's going to change after this, but we said exactly the same after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, that nothing would ever be the same again, that capitalism had been shaken to its core, and that the economy and society that emerged after the financial crisis would be one built on more solid foundations and valuing different things. But if we're honest, 10 or so years on from the financial crisis, very little has changed. I want to ensure, and I expect that most of you on this call today want to ensure, that we learn some lessons from this pandemic, and the sort of economy and the sort of society that we build in its aftermath is different from the one that we've had so far. And for me, that's about a new social contract, a new social contract between the state and its citizens, but also a new social contract within business. Now, in terms of the state, I think that means a new welfare system, a welfare system where you can survive if you are sick, if you are self-employed but out of work, if you are trying to bring up a family in an area where there are high rents. It's also about who pays tax, how much we pay, and whether we let people get away, or big corporations get away with avoiding large amounts of tax. It's about what the state guarantees in return for our contributions through the tax system. It's also a chance, I think, to build a new social contract that recognises that key parts of our social and economic infrastructure, our health, our social care, our education system, after 10 years of austerity, have not been in a place that we needed them to be in to be able to deal with a crisis and a pandemic on the scale of what is unfolding at the moment. So we need to ensure that we rebuild our social and economic infrastructure in a way that means that they can cope with increases in demand, but also that those people who work in those essential public services, and in the case of food distribution and manufacture, in private services, that we properly value what they are doing and reward them for that. It's also about a new social contract, though, within business. We often say that those people at the top of organisations get big rewards because they take big risks. But I think that this crisis really has shown that that is a fallacy, because the people who are taking big risks at the moment are not the chief executives, and not the people who sit on the company boards. They're the people on the front line. They're taking big risks, but they are in no way properly compensated for the risks that they're taking, while those people on the biggest rewards are sitting in their very comfortable homes, in some ways being able to secure themselves against some of the worst risks and the greatest risks in this crisis. But a new social contract might also mean doing something about creating a sovereign wealth fund. We've spoken many times, think tanks have written many pamphlets about a sovereign wealth fund. I think this is probably the greatest opportunity we have to create one in Britain since we discovered North Sea oil back in the 1980s. If, as it looks increasingly like we will have to do, we have to bail out the airlines and possibly other parts of our economy in the weeks and the months ahead, we should ensure that in turn for that injection of cash and capital, that in the aftermath of this crisis, we rebuild those parts of the economy in a way that redistributes income and wealth, but also helps tackle the other huge challenge that we face today, and that's the global climate emergency. These are all things that I think we should be thinking about now during this pandemic, so that in its aftermath we can build an economy and a society that are based on more fair and equitable values and enable us to meet the challenges of the future. I think this crisis has illustrated how important the state is for all of us, including for businesses, and how exposed we are when public services and the public insurance system are not available. But with that knowledge, I think also comes greater responsibilities to invest in those services, to ensure that they are always there for us. What we value should not be taken for granted, and what we value should be properly rewarded.
Rachel, thank you so much. And I can see there's a few questions that have already been submitted, and we'll hold off on those until we've heard from John. And that also gives you a chance to ask a few more as we go along. John's going to, I think, cover many similar areas that Rachel's touched on, but particularly from a geographic perspective of communities that have been struggling and how they prosper again. John, would you like to take over?
Thanks, Andrew. First of all, let me just endorse what Rachel's said. And, you know, Rachel's been a leading figure, I think, in helping us to rethink the way we conceive of the economy and what matters in terms of economic policy. What I'd like to say a couple of things in response to what Rachel said. She mentioned the notion of the foundational economy, and it's probably worth drawing the attention of the meeting to the academic underpinnings, I think, for some of the things that Rachel's been talking about. The notion of the foundational economy is one that's been proposed by my colleagues Carol Williams and Julie Froud at Manchester University. But there's now a network of academics and other researchers across Europe who are developing this idea. And if you're interested in it, there's a website. Just Google foundational economy, and it'll take you to a website where you can learn more about this concept. So the foundational economy, it emerges from thinking of the economy in terms of different zones, which we typically think of the economy in terms of sectors. But the foundational economy asks us to think of the perspective asks us to think of the economy as comprising a series of zones. The core zone, which comprises the family and household. The foundational zone, the foundational economy, which provides these essential services that Rachel was talking about. A kind of mundane sector, which provides all kinds of services and goods which we rely upon, holidays, things like that. And then the tradable sector, which includes the activities that we typically think of as driving the economy, the high-tech sector, business services, these kinds of activities, which attract most of the attention of policymakers. Policy regards the tradable sector as the source of growth, of value in the economy. But what this crisis has done has revealed the importance of the foundational economy. The activities which, as Rachel correctly pointed out, I think, are overlooked, underinvested, and even arguably denigrated. If you think of the terrible things which have been said recently about the civil service, but how now reliant we are upon them to solve the problems that we confront. This is all drawing our attention to the importance of the foundational economy, these activities which provide the essential services of civilized life, really. So if you go to the website that I mentioned, you'll find a 10-point plan for a post-COVID-19 economy, which returns our attention to the importance of these foundational services. So that's the first point I want to make. And the second point I want to make very briefly is to respond to the point that Andrew made about the importance of geography. And there are two aspects to this. One is that we've prior to this crisis, we were talking a lot about left behind places. These places which have struggled, have not shared in the growth that's arisen from developments in the tradable sector, and which are disproportionately reliant on the foundational economy. So this economy matters most in the places which are most disadvantaged, which are most left behind in the current jargon. Much of the foundational economy generally is embedded at the local scale, and this suggests the importance of local action and the critical value of local and regional government. So thinking about this local scale is extremely important, and with colleagues at UCL we have a project at the moment where we're working on precisely this issue. And there's been some pioneering action at the local scale in relation to all of the issues that Rachel's talked about and which I've just mentioned. Notably, the Welsh Government has a programme to promote innovation in the foundational economy, but also in places like Preston, there have been some interesting experiments from which we can learn. So there's a lot of experience to build upon, to share, in some cases to scale up, if you like. And those are the issues which I'd like to hear from the participants in the meeting about.
That's fantastic. Thanks, John. Right, so the way the question and answer will work is that I'm going to try and bring questioners in to speak to the meeting. Sometimes this doesn't work out, so if for any reason I can't, I'm going to just have to read out the question. But I'm going to first start to see if Matthew Godin is on the line and would like to ask his question. Matthew, are you there?
Hello, Andrew.
Go ahead.
So as for Rachel, as you said, the foundational economy is now key to all of our political discussions and a lot of other discussions because of the impact of COVID-19. What in particular made you decide to focus on these issues in your pamphlets before the crisis?
Well, thank you very much for your question, Matthew. I think I've been chairing the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Select Committee in Parliament for 2 and a bit years now, and often we are taking evidence from businesses and talking about industrial issues, and it seemed to me that the focus was often on those parts of the economy that people would say were at the cutting edge, that already had high rates of productivity, and very little focus was given to those parts of the economy that weren't necessarily internationally traded, but actually where the vast majority of people work. So if you take the foundational economy, probably around 40% of people work in industries around the foundational economy, and yet very little is ever said about an industrial strategy for social care. One of the policies that I suggested in my Everyday Economy pamphlet was about having a royal college for social care, in the same way you have a royal college for midwives, for example, to raise the status and to give workers in social care a voice and greater dignity at work. It felt to me that these parts of the economy were neglected, and yet they were essential. And it's not just about work, it's also about place, and that's what John has contributed this afternoon, and in his contribution to the pamphlet. The places where we live are incredibly important for our well-being, for our opportunities, both economic opportunities, but also for the quality of lives that we live. And again, economists speak very little about place. They expect people to move to the places where the economic activity or where the high productivity jobs are, rather than thinking about the connections people have with place. And so in the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years, I've really wanted to shift the focus onto the everyday and those policies and those interventions from government that could actually improve the quality of life for huge numbers of people.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm going to bring in Liz, and we'll come to John as well. Sorry, Liz Hind, this is. Hi, Liz. Can you hear me? Can you speak? Hello, Liz. Can you? Hello, Liz. Can you hear?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Hi, so you talk about owners of large companies that are sitting comfortably right now waiting to, ride this out and that they're comfortable. How, when you talk about policy for business, can you separate those people out from people like me who are small business owners who aren't sitting pretty right now and wondering how much longer we're going to be able to keep in business? So, we are, the high streets are suffering at the moment, and we are foundational economy and we are economy of place. So how can you talk about business and support small business?
Yeah. Well, I think the attitudes of many businesses, but particularly some of our small and medium-sized businesses, has been during this crisis to try and protect workers and keep going through incredibly difficult times. Whereas you've got the Mike Ashleys and Tim Martins of this world at Sports Direct and Wetherspoons, who would have preferred just to carry on as businesses as usual. And in the case of Wetherspoons, was not particularly keen on paying workers, even when the government introduced its job retention scheme. I think that's very different from the attitudes of many smaller businesses who I think feel a closer connection with the people who work there. And there again, my select committee have just done a call for evidence, asking workers to talk about their experience with their employers over the last couple of weeks. And we've received over 2,000 responses, often from people working from some of the biggest businesses and from household names, talking about how they're still being forced to come into work, being told that if they don't want to come to work, it's statutory sick pay or unpaid holidays, and there's no social distancing measures taking place in their workplaces, whether it's in call centres or banks or manufacturing centres, and that's totally unacceptable. And the bigger businesses, in some ways, have had the greatest amount of support for government through this crisis, with the government's and the Bank of England's commercial paper offer. The smaller businesses aren't able to take advantage of so many of those measures, and yet by and large they tend to be doing the right thing by their workers. So I would applaud what you're doing, Liz, and many other small businesses who are trying to get through this and have a business at the end of it, but also recognising the need to support workers through the process. So the everyday economy and the new social contract isn't about trying to vilify businesses. Far from it. It's recognising their importance to our society and to our economy, but it's about having a new contract between business and the state and within businesses, and in some ways maybe replicating the things that are happening in smaller businesses and ensuring that all businesses treat their workers with the respect and dignity that you would want in your workplace.
Rachel, could I ask a related question, which is from Mark Bryan? Mark asks, are you suggesting that we should get equity in, for example, airlines that are bailed out during the crisis, and that this should go into a sovereign wealth fund?
Yes, that is what I'm suggesting. During the financial crisis, we had to bail out a large number of banks, and government took equity stakes in those. And then when you could sell off those shares, which is now more or less completed, you were able to realise some of the gains in the share price. What we didn't do, though, when we nationalised Royal Bank of Scotland and Lloyds, what we didn't do was to demand or ensure that there were any changes in the business model. And I think that was a real lost opportunity, because we could have created out of that a British business bank, local investment banks, a new building society model. Instead, we nationalised and then we sold back into the market pretty much the same entity that was nationalised. And so I think a sovereign wealth fund could do two things. First of all, by taking equity stakes in these businesses, we would have a voice at the table about the business models pursued in the future to ensure that a more redistributive but also a more climate friendly policies were taken. But secondly, it's an opportunity to create a wealth fund to ensure that all of us have a stake in the big companies that are a part of our economic infrastructure. And other countries, Norway being the best example, did create a sovereign wealth fund in the 1980s out of their North Sea oil revenues. We chose not to. Norway now probably the richest country, certainly the richest Western country per capita in the world, and Britain one of the most unequal developed countries in the world. And so I think there's a real opportunity here to create a sovereign wealth fund, to do something good with the businesses that are part of it, but also to build up wealth for everybody, not just for those who are wealthy and can afford to invest in stocks and shares.
John, could I go back to you and ask you firstly to comment on the role of big business, but also to get back to the question of small high street businesses and their place in local economies?
Well, I think Rachel made the point that large businesses have been the priority really for the government in the current crisis. I think beyond that, there's a large issue to do with the size of what the Americans call corporate welfare, the huge amounts of money which the largest firms in this country are able to extract from the government for a whole variety of issues. And I think post-crisis, one of the key issues is to investigate critically the scale of that corporate welfare, the extent to which the taxpayer is getting value for money for the investments that it's making, and the grants and loans which are being given to large firms. And I think there has to be some kind of tilting of that support in the direction of those companies which provide essential services, which make up the foundational economy, and which are vital to the security and prosperity of communities. So I think this is one of the big issues that we need to think about. It's not a new issue; it's been around for a long time, but it's a critical one.
That's great. Right, I'm going to bring in Charlie Mansell. I'm just trying to locate Charlie. You should be able to talk now. Is that working?
Yes, I think I can. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, hello. Well, I did put down two questions, so I don't know which one you were asking me to.
The one that people have voted for, Charlie, was the link to Labour's electoral politics.
Oh, well, the one on Matthew Goodwin, the one, yeah. Basically what I asked was, Matthew Goodwin said it was easier for the Tories to move left on economics, a tactical move, than Labour to move right on identity, a principal values matter, which is possibly why blue Labour narratives have not had as much traction within and outside the party. So it was really to ask Rachel, do you think that an everyday and foundational economics could actually be a better way to engage with communities that have moved away from Labour in recent years on the basis of shared economic identity?
That's a great question, Charlie, and we've got a few years to come up with the answer, I guess. I think that the value of the everyday economy, I think, does have electoral value as well, because it's talking about the things that matter in people's lives. And when you hear from any political party, you want to know how it connects with them and the lives that they lead. You don't want abstract, you won't necessarily want big ideas or isms. You want to know what practical impact those policies are going to have on your life, but also whether it speaks to your life and your values and your community. And I think if we can try and connect Labour and root Labour again in our communities, as we have done in the past, then we're more likely to earn the respect and then in turn the votes of people. And I guess what I'm trying to do with this, and I've done some work with the GMB union, looking at everyday work, for example, is trying to think about through the prism of people and families and communities and what matters to their lives. And I think that it is, in a way, pretty basic. It is about the work we do and whether we feel connection and value inherent in that. It's about the places we live and the communities of which we're part. And it's about our families and relationships. And really, without any one of those three things, you can feel cut adrift. If you have strong families and relationships, if you have strong communities and places to live, and if you have good work where you feel you have a voice and treated with dignity and fairly rewarded, then I think that's pretty much the basics and the essentials for a good life. And that's really what anybody who wants to govern needs to talk about and needs to focus on. And so this really is about trying to, I guess, connect with people and communities and focus on the issues that matter to them.
Great, Rachel. I'm gonna let John off the politics question. We'll come back to John in a moment. I've got a question from Yasmin Lever. Yasmin, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you so much, everybody, for putting this together. I really appreciate it during these troubled times. So you mentioned the climate emergency, and regarding the climate emergency, would you agree this crisis, this global pandemic, which has come out of nowhere and stopped the world, is nothing compared to what would happen if we have a planetary crisis that comes out of nowhere, where maybe we won't have the luxury of sheltering at home? That might not even be an option. Should not this be a time we highlight this danger, not to create a panic, but to enforce the need, to address the need for a version of the Green New Deal to come into effect at once? Because I think a planetary crisis will be far worse. And I don't think we have the luxury of saying, oh, it'll come in 100 years or whatever. We don't know when it might come.
Thanks, Yasmin. It's a really good question, Rachel, isn't it? I mean, should we allow business as usual when this is over, or is this a moment for a fundamental reset in terms of the carbon intensity of the economy?
I think one of the things that the response to this crisis is showing in the UK, but globally as well, is that when there is an emergency and when you put your mind to it, you can put in place pretty quickly the policies, and very radical policies, that are needed to address a crisis. And you're right, Yasmin, that we do face a climate emergency, and we need to be putting the resources and the brains of the nation and of the world into tackling it. And you know, I do think that a national plan for tackling this pandemic that we're facing today, the same approach in terms of a national plan for tackling the climate emergency would serve us well. And so perhaps some of the tools and you know, people always talk about the limitations of what the state can achieve. Well, actually, only the state can rise to these sorts of challenges. That if we put our minds to it, then we could also put in place the policies in pretty quick order that are needed to tackle the climate emergency. So I think in some ways, Yasmin, I would take hope from this, that a national plan and national planning and putting the resources where they're needed to tackle a crisis on the scale that we're facing at the moment can pretty quickly be put in place. And I would argue, like you, that we need to do that in tackling the climate emergency as well. And I guess that's also one reason I think that a sovereign wealth fund could be useful. I don't think it would be right to bail out the airlines and then sell them back and then allow things to carry on as business as usual, because we do need a rethink of how our economy works, both in terms of creating a fairer and more just society, but also a greener planet as well. And so I think by government taking a stake in some of these big businesses, and in the case of the airlines, polluting businesses, we can help reshape the business model. I guess one final thing I would say is that over the last week or so, people are recognising that you can do an awful lot from your homes. You don't need to be jetting across the world or around the country to have meetings. You can do things from your home or your office. And so a lot of the essential travel by aeroplane that people have spoken about in the past, I think you'll find that businesses in the future will be thinking twice about sending people around the planet after seeing how productive people can be by using technology.
John Tomaney, can I bring you in as well? Is there a trade-off between greening the economy and the regional rebalancing you've been talking about?
Not at all. No, I think that you know, even in the most disadvantaged places, a Green New Deal could be a very positive and productive means of tackling issues in those places, creating jobs, providing sustainable low-cost sources of energy. All these kinds of issues are crucial, I think, in all communities. They could have a particularly large impact in the places which are most disadvantaged at the moment and which have not participated to any great degree in the existing model of growth, which is so unsustainable, as you know, as the speaker was suggesting. So I think the Green New Deal is clearly got to be part of, or a national plan, as Rachel was describing it, has got to be part of the post-crisis thinking. It's got to be central to it, and I don't see these things as incompatible at all.
Great. Let me bring in currently the most popular question is from Mark Bryan. Mark, can you come in? Hello, Mark. Are you there? Oh, he's still on mute. Sorry, I failed to. No, I'm afraid that's not working.
Can you hear me?
Hello, Mark. Are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, my question is about unpaid carers, and you were talking about the social care sector and how that's, you know, a highly valuable sector. Obviously, unpaid carers do a lot of very valuable work. So my question is, should they be remunerated? And if so, how would you do that? In particular, do you favour a universal basic income?
Rachel.
I think there's lots of parts of the welfare state that it's now increasingly obvious to everybody that the levels of benefits paid are not enough to sustain us. Whether it is universal credit, job seekers allowance, statutory sick pay, or carers allowance, which I think is paid at something like £66 a week, that people just can't get by on this sort of money. I've always been a little bit sceptical about universal basic income because of what I think of the value of work. And while a lot of people say, well, you know, technology is going to make so many jobs redundant in the future, I think so many parts of the everyday economy where most people work, actually technology won't be able to replace a lot of those caring jobs and creative jobs. But this pandemic has actually made me reassess that view about universal basic income and feel a lot more sympathetic towards it. I certainly think at the beginning of this crisis, if Rishi Sunak had implemented a system of universal basic income, even if it just applied to people earning below a certain threshold, it would have reduced the complexity of the system that he's put in place instead. So instead of a different system for the self-employed compared with the directly employed, to people who set up as limited companies, etc., that there would be a great deal of simplicity involved and probably a lot easier to administer on the part of HMRC and the Department for Work and Pensions if the government had very quickly set up a universal basic income. So I think that this pandemic is making all of us think again about some of our views and our assumptions. And at the moment, I'd say, you know, my thinking has changed quite profoundly about a universal basic income, and I can very much see the value of it. And I think it's part of what we need to think about when we try and re-engineer some sort of social contract for the future. And universal basic income should definitely be part of that discussion, because I think that you know, when things like this, and hopefully we won't be facing pandemics like this on a regular basis, but when things like this are thrown at us, and also as Yasmin's last question illustrated, as we have to make big changes to the way we live our lives to tackle the climate emergency as well, universal basic income can help in many ways with transition processes, and I think there'll be a lot of transitioning in the years to come, and the universal basic income could help to cushion that. What I would say though is that it's very unlikely that a universal basic income would ever be paid at a level that would replace the need for people to work and have a comfortable life. My worry about a universal basic income, it could be used particularly by some on the right to say, well, they've got a universal basic income, so we don't need to worry about regeneration policies and policies about place, for example. If the work has disappeared from a town or a region, well, as long as they've got universal basic income, they'll get by. They're not going to. They don't need our efforts. And so that'd be my one worry, I guess, about universal basic income, that it's not going to be an alternative to work, and it's not going to be a get out of jail card for the government to allow places that are already struggling and have been left behind to fall further. So I know that's a long answer, but that's, I guess, some of the thinking that I've been giving to this issue in the last few days.
There's another social security question, which I'll bring in at this point. Alistair Cryan, are you able to speak, Alistair? Alistair, are you there?
Hello?
Go ahead.
Yes. Hello.
Hello. In your book, you talk about how the party stands for dignified work and the importance of good wages. To what extent do you think working tax credit or child tax credit introduced under Tony Blair and its child universal credit introduced under David Cameron have essentially become a justification for employers not to properly pay their employees? Should we look at abolishing universal credit?
Well, I mean, the idea of paying to support families was first introduced with family allowances in the 1940s, and those ideas came from a woman MP called Eleanor Rathbone, and the first family allowances were paid on the basis that every individual had a back to be clothed, a mouth to be fed, and a mind to be nourished. And that really was the principle of family allowances, child benefits, and the tax credit system as well, and recognising that with a family especially come greater costs, and that the state as was there to support people from the cradle to the grave at a time when they had additional costs, and we all pay into the system, and then we draw on the system when we need it, either because we're out of work or we're retired, or because we're starting a family. And so I think it is right that the government support people and families in particular. I think the point you're making, though, is that knowing that tax credits or universal credits are there could allow firms to pay people less and know that those wages are going to be topped up by the state, and that in some ways can create perverse incentives. And that's why you need strong policies around minimum wage and living wages, and I would like to see the minimum wage increased to a real living wage rate so that nobody is expected to work for their poverty. That was why I would also like to see much stronger rules around, and again, this is something that we're talking about much more at the moment, about the employment status of workers, so that people are directly employed on permanent contracts rather than employers using zero-hour contracts, bogus self-employment, agency and temporary workers to get out of their obligations as employers. But I don't think that would get rid of the need to have systems of either universal credit or tax credits to ensure that people's basic needs are met. And that's particularly the case in areas, for example, where there are high property prices and therefore high rents, and when people start families and therefore their earnings power are reduced. So I think that we should be asking more from businesses, absolutely, but I don't think then that the state could step away and say, well, a welfare state isn't needed if employers are paying a bit more.
Alistair, you'll see there's a long litany of Fabian reports arguing the case for paying social security to people who are working, including our most recent, which is called Where Next. You can check it out. Can I bring in John as well on low wages, the role of social security, and Rachel also touched on self-employment.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Rachel's said, that clearly we have created a system where some employers are are able to pay their workers less than they should because they know the state is going to pick up the bill. That's unsustainable. But that's not an argument for abandoning social security and support for people at the different stages of their life and their career as workers. So I just endorse everything she's said.
Great. I'm going to now bring in Anne Black. Anne, are you still there?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. What do you think the priorities should be for the new leader?
So, bringing it back to politics, what should the new leader of the Labour Party do to take this agenda forward?
Do you want me to?
Rachel, sorry, yes, you go ahead.
Well, Anne, it's great to hear from you, one of our best ever members of Labour's National Executive Committee and chair of our party. In terms of policies for the new leader, I mean, whoever the next leader of the party is going to be becoming leader at an incredibly difficult time. You know, you announced, I remember, Anne, the results of the leadership contest in 2015 at Labour Party conference. This time the candidates have all been asked to record a video at home with their acceptance speech. What strange times that we live in. And so the circumstances of the new leader coming in are going to be really, really tough. But I think we should see this as also an opportunity to reframe the debate and to think anew about the sort of society and the sort of economy we want to create after this this crisis has passed. And in some ways, you know, we need a beverage report for the 2020s and beyond, a new settlement, a new social contract, I call it, between the state and its citizens, to reflect on and to address some of the challenges that this pandemic has thrown out, but actually we always knew were there. You know, the issues of the inadequacies in the welfare state in supporting people in sickness and in ill health. We knew about those things, but they weren't widely known or widely discussed until this pandemic. If you can't get by on statutory sick pay during the coronavirus pandemic, then you can't get by on statutory sick pay on any other time as well. And so I do think this is about a new social contract for our era, and our new leader will, I think, because the Tories aren't going to do this, the Tories in the end, although some of the policies that they are pursuing now are helping us get through this, two things about their approach. First of all, if it hadn't been for 10 years of austerity, we would be in an awful better position to withstand this sort of crisis than we are today. But also, I fear that after this, the Tories will be happy to go back to business as usual with the same welfare state, the same tax system as we had going into it. And that just can't be the case. We've got to ensure that when this crisis passed, that we've truly learnt its lessons, that we value people and things differently to what we did before, and we build a more fair and just economic and social infrastructure and society. And that, I think, is really going to be the first and most important job and challenge of our new leader and the new leadership team.
Can I add something, Andrew?
Oh, please do.
Yeah. I agree. Again, I agree with everything that Rachel said there, and I'm speaking here as an academic. But I would like to emphasise the importance. It's part of the new social settlement that Rachel is describing. The importance of recasting the relationship between central and local government. I think this is crucial. I think that we've lived through a long period of in which local government has been sort of stripped of its responsibilities and resources and its capacity to act. I think we're seeing local government responding in a very strong way to the current crisis. But devolution, particularly within England, to the local scale, but also to perhaps new regional scales, is going to have to be a critical part of of the new settlement, because without the capacity to act at this local and regional scale, much of the ambitions for refashioning the welfare state, for rebuilding work, to improving the state of our communities is going to be difficult to achieve. So whatever I'd like to, as an outsider looking into this, I'd like to see that the new leadership say something strong about that early on.
That's great. I'm now going to bring in Lord Roy Kennedy. Roy, are you there?
Much, Rachel and John. My question to you both is, what advice do you have to Labour politicians when we're looking to sort of like make sure we do not go back to the policies of the past, don't return to the old ways, as you mentioned, Rachel, very quickly, happened in the banking crisis, and we develop a sort of a new sort of post-war consensus, which of course developed policy really from the war up until 1979. Because I think you're right, we cannot go back as it was before, because the worry is that people very quickly will forget and people slip back into the old ways again.
I think that's one of the reasons why we need to be doing the thinking now, because in a few months' time, hopefully, this would have passed. And, I said in my introductory remarks, during the financial crisis, everybody said, this changes everything. And yet, what did it change? It meant that the state had a lot higher debt on its balance sheet, but it didn't really mean much of a change for the way our banking sector worked or the settlement between business and state. Even though the state came in and bailed out the economy, the social contract didn't change. And I think that there's a very real risk that, especially with the Tory government, that we just carry on as business as usual after this crisis and say, oh, well, this was just some shock that came our way and we dealt with it, and now we will carry on because nothing needs to change. And I think that would be the entirely wrong response. The right response to this would be to say, well, actually, the people who got us through this were the frontline NHS workers. It was a welfare state which is inadequate, but has been the provision has improved at least somewhat during this crisis. The people who work in our shops and getting food to our table, those are the heroes during this crisis, and yet most of the time these people are undervalued, underappreciated and taken for granted. And so I think that we've got to ensure that things change after this crisis, but that means not just assuming it's going to happen, but doing the work now. And the work that John Tomaney has done, along with Carol Williams and Julie Froud and others, is just really, really important in starting us on that journey. They've put together a 10-point plan around the foundational economy of what we might want to do, and it's looking at things as diverse as how to reduce the levels of debt after this crisis, how to rebuild supply chains, and actually that goes to one of the points that Yasmin was making earlier about more localized supply chains, about social licensing, so we demand more from businesses. It's about taxation policy. It is about rebuilding and reconstituting the welfare state, but we can't just assume because of this crisis that everything's going to change. It will only change if we do the work now, both academics and politicians and civil society, to demand those changes. And as I say, especially with the Conservative government, which I think would be happy to go back to business as usual, we must be the voices to stop that from happening.
John Tomaney, what do you think is the most important thing to make sure this crisis is really grasped as an opportunity?
I think we have to think clearly, as Rachel was saying. There's a lot of intellectual work to be done to produce a credible set of proposals which could shape this new social settlement. But I think that we can build on the fact that, unlike in the last crisis, I think there is a wide sense that the population's got that there are certain things that are important to our lives which we've undervalued, and that's a critical opening, because as Rachel said, I think the Labour Party in particular is strongly placed to respond to that in a way in which perhaps the Conservatives aren't. But it's not inevitable. It's not guaranteed that the outcome will be the things that we all want. On the contrary, there have been many missed opportunities in the past, and I suppose it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that this is not another one of those missed opportunities.
Great. Can I bring in Will Hutton?
Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Will.
Enjoyed it very much, and I've been through the 10-point plan, which Carol sent me a day or two ago. But I've got two questions for you, Rachel. The first is, I've always liked the idea of the foundational economy conceptually, but it's a pretty slippery idea. And actually, as you've talked, I see how slippery it is when it comes to everything from sovereign wealth fund through, rebooting the welfare state, through focusing on kind of key workers. Maybe this pandemic has actually shown us what the foundational economy is. It's everybody who's a key worker. And is your idea that one should somehow privilege the organizations that employ key workers, either by asking them to incorporate as foundation companies and give them tax rebates and tax privileges, and so they are different from other kinds of companies, because actually in their constitutional arrangements, when they incorporate, they acknowledge that they have these foundational obligations which they get, and privileges, which then, and I was also intrigued by your notion of the sovereign wealth fund. It's as I understand it, you're saying the state actually should behave a bit like a hedge fund or a private equity fund. It should take stakes in the distressed companies now. When the share price is higher, hopefully in 2, 3, 4 years' time, it sells them back into the public markets, repays the debt the state incurred now to take the original stake, and the capital profit becomes the foundation of the sovereign wealth fund. Is that the idea?
No, I would say that those assets are the sovereign wealth fund. You don't need to sell them to realise that. The way the sovereign wealth fund works, for example, in Norway, but in other places as well, is that those assets form the base of it. You don't need to sell them to realise value. The value is in those assets. But also, I don't see it as being like a hedge fund or private equity, even if it was a virtuous form of those. Because
now I've lost reaction.
Pardon?
Right, we've got a freeze here.
Okay.
Carry on, Rachel.
Yeah. So I don't see it being like a hedge fund or private equity, even if it was a virtuous form of that, because I would see the purpose of government taking stakes. First of all, if government doesn't take a stake in some of these businesses, they will disappear, and that will be huge numbers of jobs lost, and also economic potential ruined. But also there's an opportunity to invest in these businesses and to change in some ways their business models. We all know that airlines need to change, but without government intervention, they're unlikely to do so. So I think it's also about government taking a role and a stake to change the business models in a way that we could have done with the banks after the financial crisis, but the Conservative government, who then inherited those stake holdings in those businesses, decided just to allow them to carry on as business as usual. Whether the foundational economy is a slippery concept and can mean anything, I think that that the foundational economy is a big concept, and this isn't just about picking off one little part of the economy or society that needs to be changed. It's recognising that wholesale change is needed in how our economy and our society works. And so it's not just saying we need to value people in the foundational sectors more. It's not just about saying the government should take stakes in distressed businesses to get us through this crisis. It's not just about saying we need a new welfare state All of those things are necessary, but they're not sufficient for changing the economic and social model that we've got today. And so I think it's important that the foundational economy is not a narrow concept, but it is a broad concept, because all of these things are necessary to create the foundations of those things that I spoke about at the beginning: work with dignity and with value, strong communities and places to live, and strong families and relationships. All of those things are really important in our lives, and we're seeing that thrown into stark relief during the course of this crisis. And a foundational economy is a way about thinking of our economic system as a whole, and I think that's a good thing and not a negative thing about the concept of the foundation.
John, do you want to respond to Will as well?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that you know, the foundational economy is not just a list of jobs or essential services. It's a way of thinking about how the economy is organized. I talked about those zones at the beginning. We need to think not just about these zones as separate, but what the relationships are between each of these zones as well. So the tradable sector, its performance rests on the foundational economy. We need to think all of these things through. There's lots and lots of work to be done, but this is a very promising avenue to guide our thinking in the period ahead.
That's great. I'm going to take one more question. I'm just trying. I've got so many good ones. Let me ask. I'm going to bring in Lucy. This is the last question we're going to have time for. Is Lucy Natarajan? Hi, Lucy.
Hi, thanks very much. And thank you for hosting this. It's great to be in touch with everybody else who's thinking about these important things, like the importance of place, the importance of a new social contract, and wide agreement on things like standards of universal basic services. My question is around public understandings and involvement in this agenda. And in particular, I wanted to know what people thought about the postponing of local elections, and whether this might be something that we need more public debate about, because things are happening in response to COVID. Some of them might have reverberations, that's all.
That's great, Lucy. So there's a particular point about the postponing of the local elections, but also the wider point about bringing the public in and making sure that everyone has understanding and a stake in this agenda. John, do you want to respond first, and then I'll ask Rachel to conclude the meeting?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't thought very deeply about the postponing of local elections. I can see the very obvious practical obstacles to holding them. But I think the broader point about how we engage local communities in all of this is a really profound one. You know, Labour's great moment in 1945, I suppose, was the result of a very profound engagement, preparation of ideas in London among the elites, but also many practical experiments at a local scale by local Labour councils in London and with the LCC and in County Durham, where I am, with people like Peter Lee, practically doing things that demonstrate the value of this alternative. So it was a coming together of lots of activities nationally and locally, and many people involved in all of that. And the task to replicate that task today, I think, is extremely challenging, but it's probably going to be part of delivering this alternative and the new social contract that Rachel's talking about.
Great. And then Rachel, last word, both on bringing the public into this debate, but also how do we deliver everyday socialism?
I think the point that the last speaker made about universal basic services is a really important one, because in return for us paying into the system, the government guarantees some things to us. And actually what makes the basics of and the essentials of a good life at the moment probably should also incorporate things like us all having access to broadband, for example, whilst we're at home self-isolating. But just to sort of conclude this, I think that, you know, out of great adversity, sometimes great things can come, and we do need to take this opportunity to look at how our economy and society works with new lenses on, really, and the lenses that we've been given through this pandemic. And we need to look afresh at what we value and how we value it. And if, as I know we all do, we really value our NHS, our welfare state, the people who ensure that basic services and food gets to our table, if those are the things that really matter to us, how as a society and an economy do we value them? So I think that that's one of the things that we need to think of during this crisis, but also more profound issues about how we tax, who we tax, and the contract between state and government. And I hope that out of this crisis, something better can be built, because the lessons of this crisis, but also I would say the lessons of the last 10 years of austerity, show that our welfare state and our public services have been crumbling, and this is an opportunity, I hope, to rebuild them on more solid foundations.
Thanks, Rachel, so much. And thank you for everyone who asked a question tonight and all of you who've participated. The next Fabian Society publication is actually on the future of public services. So that will be an extremely timely thing. That's out in about 3 weeks' time. And our next online speaker meeting is on Wednesday evening with Emily Thornberry. So I hope as many of you as possible will rejoin us for that discussion with Emily. And of course, if you haven't already, do go back to Rachel's pamphlet, Everyday Socialism, and read that too. I hope you really enjoy the rest of your evening.